welcome to the Frontline Club, everyone. I think that just about everyone in the room probably already knows Heidi. It seems from sitting in the bar downstairs that Heidi walks into London and everyone knows who she is. But for the few people who might not know Heidi, Heidi's a writer and journalist and owner of a guest house in Johannesburg, and has been specialising in Southern Africa for your whole life. Heidi's the author of several brilliant books on Africa, beginning with a very well-received book on the African National Congress, through some books on African magic and on Soweto, on Johannesburg. And the book we're here to discuss tonight is the book Dinner with Mugabe, which we're going to talk about and then open up for questions from the floor. In the last few months since the book came out in South Africa, Heidi has been on just about every news channel talking about what's going on right now in Zimbabwe. I think you're certainly the last or the latest journalist to have interviewed Robert Mugabe back in December 2007. And there's very, very few journalists who've got anywhere near as close as Heidi has to an understanding of who Robert Mugabe is and what makes him tick. So it's a great opportunity, I think, to hear from Heidi about the man who has the destiny of Zimbabwe in his hands. So, shall we begin?
Yes.
The book's called Dinner with Mugabe, and that ultimately comes from your first encounter with the man. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, many years ago I met him early in 1975, just after he came out of prison at the end of 1974. He'd been there for 11 years for his political beliefs. And he came for dinner at my house. I was a very junior journalist and an activist. And I had a friend called Dr. Pally, who was a constitutional expert, who used to use me as a sort of safe house. So I had no role in this discussion between Robert Mugabe and Dr. Pally, but I cooked a dinner of roast chicken and green beans, which Mugabe didn't eat. In fact, he was, in those days, a very, very tense guy. He was in a hurry, he came late, and he needed to catch a train. I'd been told to let the staff, in those days we had a number of staff, a nanny and a gardener and a cook, off for the afternoon and the evening because he was a bit underground. He wasn't really underground, but he had been released from prison and had immediately started to mobilize support for the guerrilla war. Anyway, he kept on looking at the watch, at the clock on the mantelpiece, and then revealed that his train was going to leave at 9 o'clock and his lift hadn't arrived. So I made a quick decision to take him to the station, left my baby asleep in his cot. History doesn't record what damage that did to him. He's now a journalist, but anyhow, and drove Mugabe.
History does record.
Aunt Pally couldn't drive, and he was sitting in the back seat. Mugabe was sitting next to me, and I drove very, very fast. I was really nervous of leaving the child at home, and so I said, "I'm sorry, I'm driving so fast, but I left my baby at home alone." Anyway, the point of the story is that the next day he rang from a call box and said, "Thanks for supper, and was your baby all right?" So I always had a different picture of Mugabe for many years as a decent, caring person. And really that partly was why I decided, having watched what I thought was really quite superficial reporting from Zimbabwe from 2000 onwards, or just a bit before that, I just felt, first of all, he'd been there too long, and the journalists working on the case, many of them didn't really know the history or knew it cursorily. And that's why I did a book which I felt was needed, a more nuanced picture of not only of Mugabe, but of the history of Zimbabwe over that time, 30 years since I first met him when he came to my house.
I mean, the book goes back even beyond that. I mean, you go back to his childhood and you get some details that no one else has gathered before in the course of your interviews with all the people who know Mugabe well. You've found out a lot of detail about even his childhood. I mean, are there any aspects of his childhood that you think inform us about the man today?
Yeah, I decided I didn't really know how to do it. I just thought I have to get fresh material because there was just so little material. Mugabe doesn't speak much about himself. and so I decided to go and talk only to people who had had personal dealings with him throughout his life. In the course of doing that, I found his brother, Donato, who actually died in May last year, who was 2 years younger than him, but had suffered from quite severe diabetes all his life. Mugabe's mother, by the way, died when she was nearly 100. So, the fact that his brothers died is really not an indicator of his longevity. And I went and talked to a whole lot of people in England. I talked to Lady Mary Soames, who was the wife of the last governor in Rhodesia. I talked to Lord Carrington, who was the Foreign Secretary at the time of Lancaster House, the conference in London that gave birth basically to Zimbabwe. I talked to security agents that had known Mugabe when he was in prison. I met with Jonathan Moyo, the infamous Jonathan Moyo, who was about as close as one could get to actually speaking to people within the government, although he was no longer in the government, but he had been in the cabinet with Mugabe for a long time. And I found Donato, who was, as I say, his younger brother. That was probably the scariest interview that I did, because I arranged a lot of things through priests in the Catholic Church who have had a long relationship with Mugabe. Originally considered him a protege and were very proud of him, and now not so sure, although some of them still support Mugabe, and rather to the cost of the Catholic Church in Zimbabwe. To see Donato, I arranged it with, I went actually with Rory Carroll from The Guardian once to Kutama, where Mugabe grew up, and met this old priest. People live a long time there. He's nearly 100. And he said that he just mentioned that there was a brother there. I didn't actually know. And I said, any chance of seeing him? And he said, well, he'd have to ask him. So trundled back to Joburg and phoned remorselessly. The secret of my success is I never give up.
You're very, very persistent.
I just go on and on and on. And eventually this man said, yes, we'll come, and I did. And you were half expecting all the time for him not to be there or for the brother not to be there, but he was there. And that was quite scary, because to move into the first family and sit there for a few hours. Actually, I had a ringtone that my younger son put on my phone, which was the ZANU-PF symbol is the cockerel, and he go, and every time these cockerels that were around the house, because it's a rural house, were crowing, I kept answering my phone. I was so nervous, I think it actually probably helped me. They thought, oh my goodness. But he told me a lot of things about Mugabe's early life.
There was one little scene that I remember you telling me about, and it's in the book, where you describe Robert Mugabe not going hunting with the other boys. He's not out, he's not a fighter, he's not tough, but he's out quietly catching a bird. He's setting a little trap by the river, and he's going to catch a bird with this grass trap, and it maybe tells us something about how Mugabe operates.
Yeah, I think he is very strategic, and he used to catch the supper often, because first of all he always had a book in his hand, so he was quite content to sit by the river by himself when the other kids were hyperactive and playing and so on. I think that was quite revealing, the bird catcher who would sit and bide his time. If you look at Mugabe's history, he does tend to bide his time. He's a very vengeful man, as many people know to their cost here in this room, and if he's crossed, if he's thwarted, if he's disillusioned or rejected or humiliated, he gets revenge, Mugabe, sooner or later. And, one shudders to think, I'm sure Wilf would agree with me probably, what sort of revenge he's brewing up at this moment, because he does know that his people don't, or a lot of his people don't want him anymore. You
also have chapters about the women in his life. You mentioned his mother, and she lived a long time. You obviously describe both of his wives. I mean, his relationship with his mother was obviously very important to him. You sort of emphasize that might have affected who he became quite strongly. What point do you make about that?
Yeah, I was asked on Women's Hour this morning, didn't I give the mother a bad rap? And I'm really, I think that it is a fair criticism in a way. It does come across as being very condemnatory of her. But on the other hand, when Donato, the brother, told me that Bona Mugabe, his mother, who was very, very religious and pious, and had intended to become a nun, in fact, and had got pregnant. So, I mean, she had issues. And she was told by the Anglo-Irish priest who became a father surrogate to Mugabe. And when I spoke to him in December, he confirmed a lot of these things and said Father O'Hay had been a father substitute to him because his own father abandoned the family when he was 10 years old. He said that Donato told me that Father O'Hay had told Bona, Mugabe's mother, that he would be a great leader. He was a gifted scholar and he worked very, very hard. And she interpreted that, according to Donato, as a message from God. And after that, treated him like a holy child. And he even said that when the food was short in the family, the mother would say, "Give it to Robert," which didn't endear him to his siblings. So he was considered a mummy's boy and a coward. You know, I mean, I think his early life couldn't have been worse for a sensitive. He's a very sensitive guy. I mean, he's quite shy, very shy actually as well. And so he just buried himself in his books. He had no friends. His brother said, when he was a boy, his books were his only friends. And I asked Mugabe that in December, and he said, yes, that's true.
One of the very few encounters I've had with Mugabe was at a conference in 2002, and I asked him about Zimbabweans suffering today and the impact of the hunger and the repression. And the thing he said to me is, well, we suffered even more under the British. And it sounded very much like he was saying, I suffered under the British, that I went to prison and I had a bad time. What was his experience, as far as you could tell, from that period when he was put in prison and he was obviously mistreated in some ways? Do you think that was a moment when things turned for him?
Yeah, the interesting thing about him saying we suffered more under the British is that, you know, as people who know the history will know, Ian Smith declared a unilateral declaration of independence from Britain. And so there was a period of 15 years when technically the country had seized its own independence. But Mugabe's never accepted that. And so as he said to you, he said to me, they were British farmers. He referred to the white farmers. I didn't know he thought quite so sort of rigidly about it. He said they were British farmers, and it was the British who spoiled things for the farmers. So he discounts that period under Ian Smith, when there was, of course, a vicious war in Zimbabwe. One mustn't forget the effects of that war, which were devastating. I do think that the prison years seem to have been very painful for him. When I talked to him about the prison years, his voice dropped. When I went into his office, he sat behind this very big desk. He could have chosen something more intimate because there was a coffee table and chairs, but he sat there, and I put the tape recorder right in the middle of the desk. And when he spoke about himself, when I asked him personal questions, which I did a lot, I was there for 2.5 hours, his head would slump forward. He's very shy, and I got the feeling he probably hadn't ever really been asked those kind of questions. You know, like I asked him, had he ever been deeply in love and things like that. And his head would fall forward, and his voice would just about, and that period when I talked about the prison years, his voice almost disappeared. I really could hardly hear it on the tape. So I didn't go into too much what happened to him in prison. I couldn't stand it up. I suspect that he might have been tortured in prison, but I couldn't get anybody, even though I spoke to his prison priests and various people. I think it was very painful for him. But characteristically, what he did is he read books. He got 6 of his 7 degrees in 11 years in prison, and that just tells you how many books he read, you know. And instead of processing his pain and his hurt and his grief that had been accumulating his whole life long, this man is completely disconnected from his emotional apparatus. He's very developed intellectually and not at all emotionally. And I kept getting evidence of that in all the time I researched it.
Then he becomes president in 1980. He appears to be a man of forgiveness, and everything's going to be fine. Zimbabwe is a model of reconciliation, and obviously before South Africa came along, this is the great hope for the region. At that point, did people think that he was going to be a great leader? I mean, did no one think he'd gone wrong at that point?
No, many people there were, certainly the white Rhodesians, as they had been, were very sceptical of him. Lots of people were sceptical. Actually, before he came in, so were the British. But he had a very good and unexpectedly good relationship with Lord Soames. For some reason, these two really clicked. When I interviewed Lord Carrington, he said, "Oh, it was jolly good of Christopher to be so nice to Robert." But I think it was a completely genuine relationship, in fact. I don't think Soames put that on. And certainly Lady Soames, who's Churchill's daughter and a lovely woman, was very fond of Mugabe. And all those years later when I went to see her, she really was puzzled at what had happened to him, because she'd liked him so much. And he rocked up at Lord Soames's funeral. Sally and he just jumped on an airplane. And they were having this private family lunch of Prince Charles and Diana and their children. And suddenly the Mugabes arrived at their country house. And she's a lovely woman, very nice woman. She just quickly made set two more places at the table. So, you know, this was the kind of company that Mugabe was used to keeping. But incidentally, there was an occasion a few years ago when the media got very indignant because Mugabe strode up to Prince Charles and shook his hand and said, "Oh, look at him trying to embarrass Prince Charles." But actually, he knew Prince Charles. You know?
So I mean, his relationship with the British is a very strong theme within the book, and you explain again and again how he himself feels almost English. I mean, he feels an association with Britain that is incredibly powerful, and something perhaps that we in Britain don't appreciate, just how strong it is. And from the Victoria Falls Hotel, the little details of telling his children to behave politely because this is the hotel where the Queen has visited. I mean, he's very, very concerned about his links to Britain and his links to the royal family. I mean, that comes across very strongly in the book.
Yeah. Yes, it is. When I was talking to him about Lady Soames, I wanted to get a laugh out of him early on so that he would relax. So I told him an anecdote that Lady Soames had said to me that when things were going off the rails in Zimbabwe around 2000, her friends had said to her, "Mary, do something." And she'd say, "Well, what must I do?" And say, "Well, you know, Robert, write him a letter." And she said, "Well, I can't do that. I've already taken him off my Christmas card list." And he laughed. He slapped his thighs. He thought that was so funny. But then it reminded him of his estrangement from the royal family, and he nearly cried. I could see his eyes were glistening with emotion as he said. And I wrote it in the last chapter verbatim, as he talked about how, because of politics and Tony Blair, his relationship with the British royal family had been severed, and how painful that was to him. And he said how the British royals had all stayed with him at State House. I mean, he's been there a long time. And I mean, I think that was genuine grief. Of course, he's also very aggrieved, and he's full of, he doesn't take any responsibility for anything, because he is an emotionally very retarded guy. So everything's somebody else's fault. But I think it's genuine emotion about the British. And all of that anger that comes out, and I've always felt it has the intensity of a family quarrel. I mean, he's so angry with the Brits, and it goes on and on for years and years. And I think that's exactly what it is. I think Mugabe spent his whole life trying to be British. I mean, it's really quite pitiful. As I say, his father surrogate, Father O'Hay, who he talked about very fondly. He said Father O'Hay used to take these little boys down to the river and do backstroke, and they could sit on his chest. And he loved Father O'Hay, but he was an Anglo-Irishman. And so I think that the Mugabe is half a Brit. I mean, he's related to you guys. And he feels very painfully that Britain has rejected him. And of course he makes it impossible for any rapprochement, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. But I think under that anger is love for Britain. And unfortunately, because of this dual African and British identity, I think the British part of Mugabe sometimes despises the African part. When you see something like Murumba, which was that campaign he did a couple of years ago, which was so brutal against poor African people who were eking out a living on the pavement. I think that was you know, the British Mugabe coming along and thinking, oh, this is such a mess, you know, for goodness sake, let's clean it up, you know. And so I think half of him is a king, you know, a British king, and he behaves like that. And he dresses, you know, he's beautifully dressed, and half the time he's so quietly spoken, and then the rest of the time when he's got that baseball cap on and all those gaudy African prints, he's shouting, hurling abuse. Yeah, he's a complicated man.
Sure he is.
Yeah.
One of the themes of the book is you're asking, is there a moment that you can identify where he changed from this charming, considerate person who phoned you the next day after your drive to the station and asked whether your son was okay, and then the man who's presented as a monster today? Are you able to pinpoint a moment where you think things changed, or how do you see it? Do you think he is the same person today that he was then?
I think there are a number of moments. He's the same person, but he's diminished. It's not only because he's old. He's angry. You can sense it, you know, when you're with him. He's all coiled up, you know. He was always distilled. He's a very spare man, you know. He's not going to say anything that's not absolutely measured and necessary. Very, very controlled. I suspect part of that comes from his sort of the Jesuit environment in which he grew up. But I think that two key moments, there were more, I think, but the two key moments, I think, was 5 years into his premiership. In terms of Lancaster House, the Whites had 20 guaranteed white seats, and 5 years in, there was an election. And unfortunately, Ian Smith had offered himself as the leader of the Whites, which he shouldn't have done. So he was always there as a sort of as a token alternative, though of course he was history by then anyway. The Whites voted against Mugabe, and he had gone to such lengths up to then to reassure them, partly under Soames's influence, and he and Soames, as I say, hacked out a deal where Mugabe agreed to a best person government. He had whites in all the key portfolios initially, and he couldn't have done more for white Rhodesians. And when they voted racially against him, because there was no other explanation, he was very hurt. He is a thin-skinned guy. He's a very sensitive guy. And more than that, he was angry. And I think that was one of the moments. And he said at the time that he thought, in retrospect, it had been a mistake to try to bring the whites along. That was one moment. And the other was definitely Claire Short's letter, although when I asked him, was it Claire Short's letter, he said, well, it wasn't the letter, it was the attitude of the British government. You have to explain
the letter. Not everyone in the room will know about Claire Short's letter.
Claire Short, who was the Minister of
Development.
Overseas Development, the ODA. She had just come into office with New Labour, and she wrote a letter to Mugabe, at least to his minister, saying, I haven't got the actual wording, but we're a new government composed of different interest groups or different people of different origins, and we don't think that we have any further responsibility for land redistribution in Zimbabwe. I myself am Irish, she said, with more in common. I have more in common with the oppressed than the oppressor. A really deeply offensive letter, I think everybody would now agree, and that also offended him deeply. And he makes reference to that era. That's why he hated Tony Blair so much, because he didn't take that out on Claire Short. He assumed that came from the British government, as indeed he was entitled to, and I've seen the original letter. It's on official letter paper. And that was definitely a terrible moment for him, because partly it's not really understood that Maggie Thatcher, who was the Prime Minister at the time of Lancaster House, had lost her job and John Major had taken over. And although she had said, look, this money's been partly squandered, which was true, some of the money was being used to purchase farms for Mugabe's cronies and so on. And she said the British taxpayers' money is not going to be thus used, and that was the end of it. There was a 2-year standoff, and then when John Major came in, he cranked it up again. And I think that's why Mugabe particularly, and he said that when I talked to him, particularly resented it, because they were sending missions to and from London in order to put it back on the table because Major accepted that the land redistribution program should be ongoing. When Tony Blair came in, it just got absolutely swept aside. I think partly Labour, I don't know if you agree with this, but I think partly the Labour government, many of the people, older people in the Labour Party had supported Mugabe, as we said earlier, and had gone to great lengths, I think, to support him. So I think there's a bit of a family quarrel there as well, that people are really very annoyed with Mugabe for letting them down. He himself thinks that he'd get a better hearing with the Tories because the Tories, he says, understand better the repercussions of colonialism. And indeed, I think that's probably true because, I'm sure that people like Claire Short just thought, colonialism didn't have anything to do with us. We're Labour, but that's absurd. It's Britain, it's not a question of which party's in power and so on.
Now, you've had an interview that almost every journalist who goes down to Southern Africa sort of dreams about sitting down with Mugabe and asking him any question you like, but it wasn't easy to get it. You worked very, very hard to get it. Do you want to just sort of spell out what you did to get your meeting with Mugabe?
Nothing untoward.
Give the sanitised version.
Among the people I interviewed for this, as I say, this fresh material, was Father Fidelis Mukunori, is the head of the Jesuits in Zimbabwe. And I had 3 interviews with him. And after a while, I realized he was very close to Mugabe. And so at the end, I said to him, will you take me to meet Mugabe? And he looked at me for a long time and then said, yes. And so that was the beginning. Of course, it was very much the beginning. I then phoned him every week from the middle of 2006, remorselessly. And as time went by, more regularly. And he at a certain point, he said, send your books. I've got a number of published books by way of a CV, which I did. They were actually on Mugabe's desk when I interviewed him. On one occasion, he was on retreat, and I found him. He said, I can't believe you found me. I'm in the bush. And anyway, come mid-November, when my copy deadline was expiring, I said to him, it's now or never, because this book's got to go now, because I was timing it for the election. And he said, well, why don't you just come up here and wait? Which I did. And I waited 5 weeks next to the telephone because I was scared that if I moved away, that call would come. After 2 weeks, I was called in to George Chiramba's office. George Chiramba is his spokesperson. He's the head of the information department inside the presidency. And I was grilled by him and 8
his flunkies.
Yes. Yeah. 8 intelligence agents, all of whom had a notebook and were supposedly writing in the notebook. The only person who spoke to me was Chiramba, quite menacingly, actually. He sat opposite me. I moved up. I was on a little sofa, very small office, thinking, God, where are all these guys going to sit? So I moved up, but none of them came and sat next to me. They all brought in chairs and sort of ranged themselves around. And it's interesting, you never quite know how you're going to react. I wasn't actually expecting that. I was expecting just to be, coming from the outside via Father Mukunori. I didn't think I would go into the official channel, so it came as a bit of a surprise. And the interesting, as I say, you don't know how you're going to react. And what I did is you can only really be yourself, and I didn't have anything to hide anyway. So I just answered honestly. And after a while, I didn't actually write this because I didn't think people would believe me. Sometimes these regimes are really quite absurd. And because I just gave straightforward answers to the questions that I was asked, they actually all laughed all the way through. And so, for example, he would say, Chiramba leaned forward like this and said, and he's a big guy, and he's a smart guy, and he's quite an attractive guy, and he was angry. And he said, normally, we tell the president when there's a journalist in the country. On this occasion, he told us. I said, I said to him, I hope you aren't going to hold that against me. And they all laughed. Yeah. So I think what happened was, because it was so straightforward, it made them feel a bit foolish. Because here I was, just a regular person, a middle-aged woman, hardly an obvious threat to anybody. And for example, when he said, scathingly at one point, "So you came through the back door?" I said, "Only because the front door wasn't open." And then he said, "Why didn't you interview anybody in the government?" Because he asked me to list who I'd interview. I told the truth all the way through. He asked me to list the people that I'd talked to. He said, "Why didn't you talk to anybody in the government?" I said, "Because I was too scared." And it's such a simple answer, and it's actually a stupid question, and so they all tittered a bit. And then right at the end, it was an hour, and I was scared. Actually, my heart was thumping. I really was scared, but I just thought, and so I just played it straight. I was thinking all the time, I'm shooting myself in the foot. But funny enough, that wasn't the effect of it. And so right at the end, he said, "What do you think of Zimbabwe?" And I said, "It's a tragedy." And I could feel them tense, these guys, that was. And he said, he's very sarcastic. He said, "Oh, well, that depends on your political perspective." I said, "No, I'm not talking about politics. I'm talking about economics, and that depends on having a look around you." And they all tittered again. And then, to my surprise, he said, "I have absolutely no hesitation in recommending that you see H.E." They call him H.E., His Excellency. And then I realized that he probably had no power to turn me away anyway, because H.E. had already said he'd see me. So I was scared for nothing.
But you sat there for 5 weeks, and I think you're persistent. You were so persistent. No one else would have stayed there and just kept phoning them and kept waiting for the phone calls. I think they wanted to get rid of you in some way.
Yeah. Well, Father Mukanui told me that he said to H.E. at one point, "This one's not going away." Yeah.
And the interview itself, it was a long interview. It wasn't like 10 minutes going in and going out. They obviously thought this was the right moment to sit down and tell somebody for 2 or 3 hours what they wanted to say.
Yeah. I think Mugabe wanted to talk to me for some reason. He knew that I had this little bit of history with him. He knew I'd once admired him. There was a closed-circuit TV focused on him the whole time, not filming the interview, but filming his responses. And Chiramba told me that it had taken such a long time to organize. Just after they came back from Lisbon was when I saw him, because Mugabe particularly wanted to give it his attention, so he said. And 2.5 hours was a long time. I had actually prepared, because I worked with 3 psychologists in synthesizing this fresh material that I got from the interviews. The reason I did that was because the material I was getting, because I was only talking to people who'd had personal dealings with Mugabe, was neither strictly chronological nor strictly thematic. So at a certain point I thought, well, this is lovely, lots of nice anecdotes, but how am I actually going to put it together? How am I going to analyze it? And then I suddenly thought, he's so complicated, I realized by then, that I'll work with some psychologists, which I did. And so before I went up, in the hope of getting the interview, I spoke to them as to how I should deal with him. And it was useful to know that. And they said, "You know what, you won't be able to contradict him." Because we'd already worked out exactly who he was. And I think when I walked in there, I probably knew him as well as he knew himself. Because they were really good. They interpreted how the external events of his life impacted on him internally. And he's the all or nothing man. You're either good or bad, and he can only be good, In fact, outside Chiramba's office, there's this huge sign, big banner, with letters like this saying Mugabe is right. And that's inside the presidency.
What have they got to prove?
So, exactly. So they said to me, if you're going to contradict him, you'll see his anger, which you can see it. It's sparks in his eyes. You could actually physically see it, because he's very impassive otherwise. He's very quiet and doesn't really react very much, except when you contradict him. And then the anger is palpable, and he's warning you, And if I'd gone head-to-head, like, for example, that Sky interview 3 years ago, where Stuart Ramsey, it was a regular TV interview, and he went head-to-head with Mugabe, I would have been out of there in 10 minutes. He just would, Chiramba sat on my left and Father Mukanui sat on my right, and he would have just shot him a look, and that would have been the end of it. So each time he flared up like that, I got back in my box, and then I go back to some personal questions, and then I come out again. And that's the only way you can do it. And that's why, people say he doesn't know what's going on accurately in the economy and so on, because people don't tell him the truth. But actually you can't tell him the truth. So nobody around him is in a, except they'll be in the fullness of times time a couple of generals who will walk in there one day, I suppose, and say, hey, the game's up. But nobody else can tell him the truth because you just won't be there in the morning. That's it.
Yeah. I love your description. We'll open up for questions in a minute, but I love your description of seeing him slumping in the chair, and he goes lower and lower, and you wanted to go around and lift him up and sit him up straight again in his chair.
He was in this big yellow chair, quite threadbare. The interesting thing about him is he had this ancient old radio, an old portable box radio with big dials and that metal handle and the aerial that you yank up. My dad had one. He used to carry it around listening to the cricket commentary. And that was next to his desk. He has no computer. He had an unpacked Hewlett-Packard box there, which I think might have a computer in it. And nothing really, no adornments. I don't think Mugabe is materialistic. That's not what makes his hair fly back at all. But so he's sitting in this big yellow chair and quite threadbare, as I say. And he kept slumping down, and then he'd pull himself up like this, and then he'd slip again. And I thought, I don't know, it's a slippy chair or what. And then he'd pull himself up again and sit straight for a bit. And I did have that feeling like with a kid, there's sometimes children are always, all over the place. You wanted to go and sit him up there, as Adam says. But when I asked the psychologist, the interesting thing was, I said, what's that about? He said, and when you see him walking also, he's often, flailing his arms around. He's quite uncoordinated. And one of them said something that I thought was very interesting. She said, it's a reflection of how developed the man is in his intellect, but it's not an integrated development. So if you see somebody who's had a minor head injury or smoked too much dope, or sometimes you see people that have minor brain injuries or things aren't working. It's very often reflected in the body language, and that made absolute sense to me when she told me that.
We should open to questions. I guess while we get the microphones ready, I'm going to ask one more, and then we'll get people to put their hands up. But we've talked obviously about everything up until you finished the book. But since you finished the book, a huge amount has happened, and we've had the first round of the election, and we've got the second round coming up in just a few weeks. You can give a very short answer to this if you want, but do you think that in a month's time, Robert Mugabe will still be the president of Zimbabwe?
Yes.
Okay, questions. There's a man at the back there, and then Richard at the front here.
Heidi, hi.
Hi, Paul.
Paul Moorcroft. Can I ask you two questions about getting rid of Mugabe? Now, you might have been misrepresented in various articles, New York Times, Washington Post. You imply that you think the book shouldn't put any sanctions or any more pressure on him. My view is that there should be pressure on him if he's going to stay there, and there's only one man that can do that, and that's President Mbeki. Do you think Mbeki should finally get off his butt and do something about Mugabe, because the Zimbabweanization of South Africa is moving on apace? And the other question, which we've had a little debate about, do you think the idea of sending him to The Hague or court, any sort of court, is valid? How do we get rid of him, and how do we get justice?
Okay, we'll take Richard's question as well, shall we? Or how do you like to do it?
Mine's supplementary. Richard Cockett of The Economist. And I wanted to ask you about Mugabe's relationship with Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki, and whether you could shed any light on these two, because a lot of people say that it was partly jealousy of Nelson Mandela after 1994 that contributed significantly to him going downhill, and also that he utterly despises Thabo Mbeki personally and emotionally. That's a very big reason for why we are stuck in this situation that Mbeki has no leverage on. So could you shed some light on
Can I answer that first?
Sure, sure.
He's very jealous of. He was very jealous of Mandela. As a white South African, you can't really use the sort of the analogy of childlike, because it has all sorts of connotations. But Mugabe is really very childlike in his emotional apparatus. If you see him when he has a birthday, his birthdays are always played very big in the media, because he's got a birthday cake. He's got 84, and it's got candles. And in fact, there's one picture of him standing holding balloons in both hands. And that actually, and the media always say, oh, look at him. He's such an callous guy as people are starving and he's having this big birthday. I actually think it's not that. I think it's a very deprived child saying, it's my birthday, you know. And because he's so intellectually developed, you know, you don't sort of see that so much. Anyhow, Mbeki, I don't think that's the reason in the case of Mbeki. And Paul's question about shouldn't Mbeki get off his butt. Of course he should, and especially in terms of South Africa, because the message it sends that he has this tacit approval of Mugabe is disastrous in a country that has some considerable difficulty with its own morality, generally speaking. But I don't think it's that. He calls him Little Mbeki because he sees himself as the grand old man, you know, and I mean he has got that status in Africa, and he's you know, he feels he's earned it. But I don't think it's that. I think what informs Mbeki is the fact that Morgan Tsvangirai, the MDC, has come out of a trade union base, which is his Achilles heel, and he's been supported by whites very publicly, you know, some years ago, and he's supported by Western powers and so on. And that freaks Mbeki out. That's what I think. And, you know, the South Africans behind the scenes are quite open about that, saying there's no way that they will back an MDC win there, you know. I mean, they may have to, but, you know, they're not going to go out of their way to do that. So in Mark Fisser's book, the biographer of Mbeki, he says that there's an old filial relationship and that Mugabe was friendly with, you read all that, with Govan and Mbeki's father. And all of that may be true. And I think Mbeki has been a little bit misjudged in the sense that I think he thought he had some leverage. And I think he thought that he could keep that leverage, quiet diplomacy, and finally pull it out of the bag. But actually Mugabe doesn't listen to him. So he was wrong. He should never have volunteered for that job. The only people I believe Mugabe will listen to is the Brits.
Is there who?
The Brits.
The Brits, yeah.
I know, you know, there's not much chance of that, but I think he's very keen to be acknowledged, and he's hurt, he is deep down hurt by the fact that he's now vilified. He considers himself a world statesman, you know, he's outwitted all his opponents. He certainly is a consummate politician, I think one has to accept.
What about putting Mugabe on trial? Should that be ruled out as a way of getting him out of office, or should that be an ultimate goal to have him on trial for crimes against humanity?
Oh, I mean, of course, he has to pay for his crimes. I couldn't possibly say that should be waived. I did ask him about that. I asked him, did he fear the consequences of international justice? And he said, oh, it's all politics, you know, and he went on about how come George Bush doesn't have to account for, you know, his sins in starting an illegal war and so on. And then I asked him a much more direct question, and I said to him, would you like to place on the record your regret at Kukuruhundi, which is his major human rights abuse so far? And he said no. He said it was an insurrection which had to be put down. But then logically, Paul, if you think of it, he couldn't have said yes because that's an admission to it. So, yeah, I'm sure he does fear international justice. Chiramba told me while I spent about 3 hours talking to Chiramba in State House before the interview took place, and he told me he makes constant reference to the Charles Taylor case.
That's
very informed by it.
Yeah.
And so, of course, this international justice enables, it makes it more difficult to get rid of a person like Mugabe. It's a sort of an unexpected consequence, perhaps of something that should make sense. But in the case of Mugabe, I definitely think Mugabe's never going to go along with any assurances from anybody that he won't have to face international.
We take another pair of questions. There's a gentleman at the back there.
Matthew Shonimo, Christian Aid. One episode in terms of Mugabe's psychosis that you didn't mention is the death of his son during the prison years. His son Nana was in Uka. And I wondered whether either in the book or generally you had any reflections about what impact that may have had on him. And lastly, I strongly agree with what you identified, this sentimental Anglophilia that there is paradoxically in Mugabe. But he's not the only one. There's a whole generation of nationalists, African, but not just African, who share that. So did Nkrumah. Yeah. So does Mandela, and so did Nehru in India. So whilst, Mugabe has that sentimental attachment that coexists with all the antagonism, a whole series of other leaders, good and bad, have also shared it.
I don't agree with you about Mandela. Mandela's, of course, a prince, and Mandela doesn't have that sense of inferiority. Mandela was always superior, and for that matter, just in my region, the other successful African leader, Seretse Khama, was an African chief. So I don't agree with you that it's common to all those. It's common to leaders who have come from emotionally deprived backgrounds. Mbeki, for example. In that sense, this book is quite a commentary on African leadership, I think. I hope.
I think I saw a hand up just to your right over there. Did I see a hand? Okay, there's a lady over there.
Thank you. My name is Victoria Kabaza-Laval, Zimbabwe. On the same issue you're talking about the Britishness, I'm a product of a colony, and my husband called me more English than the English, and it's something I really understand, that my generation, not all of it, we grew up at our schools, we couldn't speak Shona, we couldn't speak our own languages. I identify more with English culture than I do my own. And I find that it instills this sense of searching for an identity, but at least I don't have a whole country to mess up. But a whole generation of us grew up with that, where we felt more, I don't know if it's a sense of the colonialization or whatever it is, but we grew up with that sense of being more English. And I feel in the schools, he instilled all these rules where we were more English. The golf clubs, we had the hat stands and the caddies, and I went to boarding school, and I say "yeah" all the time, and that's I find that it's very, very important in understanding his psyche. I feel he feels betrayed, because he's like a child. For all that time he was the gold. How many honorary degrees does he have from the UK? I think he was knighted. He was. And all of a sudden, these people who he thought were there for him have rejected him. So that comes, into the psyche of who this man is. But anyway, that's just a comment, just letting you know how a lot of Zimbabweans of my generation, we don't identify ourselves as Zimbabwean. Or I had a man accost me at a cinema. We went to see an African play, and he said to me, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Zimbabwe." And he says to me, "Well, you're not Zimbabwe, you're not African." But it just goes to say, it's an identity issue, and I have it myself. So here's this man he's instilled it. Education is very central to who Mugabe was, and so he educated us. And so I'm a product of Mugabe. They call me a born free because we're born after independence. So we are who he created, and I'm very torn between this father figure, which is what he sees himself, and the man that worries me. I've read a lot of biographies, and it's very personal. And some of the people we know, I've met him, and some of the people I have very close family who very closely aligned to him. And then I have family in MDC, so I'm very torn between people. But anyway, that's just a general comment. What I'd like to ask you is, I found very interesting after these elections, there was a silence from him. As a child of, living in Zimbabwe, it's a cult of personality. There's not an hour that goes by where something is not said about him, or he's not shown on television. There used to be this joke in Zimbabwe that, if he's not there, he must have died if you don't see him on the television. But there was this deathly silence from him just after these elections. I'd like to know, because you've had more personal interaction with him, what that might say. Does he not have the control? He's a very, very belligerent man. If he was confident of his win, I, as a Zimbabwean, would think he would have come out and said, "I don't care what Tony Blair says." He calls them, we have a Blair toilet, I think in Africa, which is one of these pit latrines, So he always laughs and calls, Tony Blair the Blair toilet. He doesn't care. So for him not to say anything for that long, that for me raised a lot of questions. Who's actually in control? Because that is not the Mugabe I've known all my life. And that worried me.
Okay, well, maybe also I realised we didn't respond to the previous question.
We didn't talk about Paul's...
About the son, yeah.
Okay, well, there's a lot of issues there. By the way, I think all colonials have struggled, not only black colonials struggle with this relationship with Britain. I mean, when I talk to Carrington, I can hear myself pushing up my vowels. We've all looked to Britain for excellence our whole lives, and the flip side of that is a sort of sense of inferiority that one has. And I mean, this is quite deeply felt by even a bullshit person like me. And if you've in addition got racism chucked into that lot, it's not surprising that somebody of Mugabe's age, Mugabe embodies colonialism. Mugabe is 84 years old. Half his life was spent under British colonialism. Then he discounts the 15 years which were the disastrous years under Ian Smith. So Mugabe has tried his whole life to be a Brit. It's actually pathetic, as I say. What were the other things?
Well, we mentioned the death of his son and
Yes.
while he was in prison, whether...
Yeah. We didn't answer Paul's thing about the New York Times either. Sorry. Yes, when I asked him about the prison years, I didn't actually dwell on the child specifically. He was devastated by the death of a child. It was his only child for many years. Sally couldn't have more children after that. She had renal problems for many years and was dying for a long time. It was one of the reasons, I think, that she, reluctantly I'm sure, endorsed the relationship that he had with Grace, because his second wife, who he plucked out of the typing pool, had bore him two children before Sally died. And again, you know, many people have cited that as the actions of a very heartless man. But my information was that she, as I say, she always supported him to the hilt. They were the king and queen of utopia. She rather had that same sort of view that everything was possible and life would be wonderful and nobody would be hungry again and everybody would be waving flags. She was very like him in that way. And so she saw Grace as being a trophy wife who would give him children and give him a young, virile image. And so, yeah, I think that's true. And the child, you see, the problem with Mugabe, he should have grieved for that child, but he didn't, because he doesn't know how to do that. His emotion, his whole life, from the time that his older brother died, and he described that very movingly in the interview with me. He described how his older brother, who was 15 when Robert was 10 and was very much the favorite in the Catholic community as well, he said to me he was cleverer than him and he was an athlete, which Robert wasn't. And this brother took a drink of water out of a gourd that had held insect poison and was poisoned and ran 15 Ks or whatever it was, I can't remember, to go to his grandparents, who, by the way, he told me were considered heathens in the Catholic community where he grew up. He used to have to get permission to go and visit his heathen grandparents. I tell you what, this boy ran all that way and then lay on the floor, and Mugabe described it. He said, "My tummy, my tummy, my tummy," you know, and he was living it like he was this 10-year-old child. It was very weird. And then he described how his grandfather, the parents weren't there, the father, I don't know where they were, but the grandfather said, we should take him to hospital, but we hear that in Salisbury the surgeons cut you open. I mean, it's just an insight into what a deprived background he comes from. So the boy died because the father didn't want to risk, taking him to hospital. And so, yeah, I think that the death of that child was profound, but the problem is he didn't grieve the child. And what you see in Mugabe now, coming out of every pore, is all this anger that he's internalized for 84 years, you know. And that's why, going back to what Paul Moorcroft was saying, I did write an op-ed piece in the New York Times which drew some criticism, along the lines of, is she suggesting that we look past all the human rights abuses? I said that I thought that Western diplomacy had failed in terms of Mugabe, that these sanctions, which are pretty ineffectual anyway, were just used by Mugabe to fuel his propaganda machine, and that humiliating Mugabe is disastrous because he can't take it, he can't tolerate it. It just makes him fight more and more and more. So the headline of that op-ed piece was "Make Peace with Mugabe." So I was suggesting that, you have to get rid of the guy, and so rather engage him in some other different conversation. Don't go and intensify the sanctions and make him angrier and angrier, because he'd take it out on Zimbabweans, So I've been beating that drum a bit around the place.
Do you think that, given the British theme that we've talked about, do you think that Britain talking to Robert Mugabe, there's any prospect of talking him out of office?
I actually do. I do think that Mugabe is obsessed with the British. And when you talk to him, he goes on and on about it. But he would like to come to Downing Street. He doesn't want, he doesn't want some low-key, so it's not going to happen, I don't suppose, in that way, or certainly it won't now. But the problem is that, as Wilf and Banga will tell you, the way that the military are being disported in the rural areas at the moment is really very scary. I mean, there are quite a number of very reliable reports coming now to show how the runoff is going to be conducted, that the green bombers are going to be in uniforms and the war vets are in uniforms, and they're monitoring and watching over the police so that cases of assault are not actually reported. And then the chiefs are also involved in this kind of surveillance operation, all of which looks remarkably like the old guerrilla warfare that Mugabe and his generals know only too well. So, I just feel the diplomacy of the West has been based on two assumptions. One, he's going to die one of these days, and as I say, his mother lived till she was nearly 100. And two, that it can't get any worse in Zimbabwe, but it's got steadily worse in Zimbabwe. So, who am I to speculate? But I wouldn't be too surprised if things don't go really, really bad, because Mugabe is very angry now. I think that's the reason you didn't hear from him for such a long time, that he was licking his wounds, and he's hurt and he's angry because his own people have rejected him now. And so it may be that Britain has to re-engage simply because Africa can't do anything, and Mugabe doesn't listen to Africa. So it may be that by default Britain will have to re-engage under far less auspicious circumstances than exist at the moment. I think there's I think there's some reason to think that perhaps there might be some exploratory stuff going on,
Any more questions? One here and one over here.
Sorry. My name's Chris Gregory. I'm a Zimbabwean, in exile, I guess, in a sense. First, a quick comment about Mugabe going silent. I mean, I recall him going silent, which other people do, in the immediate aftermath of the 2000 referendum defeat. He went completely quiet for 2 weeks. Some commentators put a very positive spin on that, and we know what happened after that. So I think when Mugabe goes quiet, you need to watch out. The question I've got really is, in the light of how things have turned out since 1980, whether you've got any thoughts as a South African and as somebody who knows Mugabe so well, what sort of lessons there might be for the way in which minority groups in South Africa are responding to post-apartheid rule.
Okay, just before you take that, let's get another question just to get a few more people. I'll remind you what that.
Hi, my name's Oliver Phillips. I'm from the Britain Zimbabwe Society. Two brief questions. One is you talked about Catholicism quite a bit, and I wondered if you think, from Mugabe's perspective, there's any way of reconciling the kind of increasing opposition he's seeing from within churches, including the Catholic Church, to the sort of actions that he's increasingly involved in that the church is oppositional to in Zimbabwe. How does he reconcile those things? And the other is related, and that is, I don't know if his approach towards sexuality is rooted at all in his Catholicism, because and I wondered if you have any comments on that at all, because it strikes me as very odd that there's a kind of, he's used it very instrumentally, but at the same time it's a deeply Western colonial or Western notion of sexuality as hetero or homo that he's clearly perpetuating the whole time. And I wondered if you spoke about that at all.
What's first?
Lessons for South Africa.
Okay. By the way, one thing you said, I would like to amplify. It's so interesting. You say, I know him so well. I've spent 2.5 hours with this guy in 30 years. But it's a commentary on the failure of diplomacy. That nobody knows anything about Mugabe. None of the diplomats. I speak to a lot of diplomats because they also think I know him so well. And it really is quite shocking that I think. Ahmadinejad similar. There's certain people who are beneath contempt. You just ignore them, but what time they're cooking up a storm. In Mugabe's case, to ignore him and humiliate him is a disaster. It's his absolute playing into his weaknesses. That lessons for South Africa. I don't think South Africa is the same. Is going. There is a zonification of the ANC, and there are aspects I think the most similar thing was the character of Mbeki, actually. And Mbeki's now on his way out. I think Mbeki is a very similar makeup. And in fact, when I did my second last chapter, prior to the interview with Mugabe, which was a summation of, it's always scary when you write the last chapter, because you can have written 85,000 words and you're not absolutely sure if you've got anything to say at the end. So I'd saved a couple of issues. One of them was why Africa has supported Mugabe so much, and the other was Mugabe's Britishness. And I sent it to the main psychologist who advised me, and I said to her, please come back to me soon, because sometimes she kept the chapters for a whole week, and she used to listen to the tapes and the chapters, and a very laborious process. And she phoned me that evening and said, it's fine, I wouldn't change anything. I said, are you sure? Because normally she gave me lots of uphill. And she said, no, put it this way, she said, I had a dream last night that Thabo Mbeki rang me and said, could he come for sessions? And I didn't get it. I said, you mean Mugabe? She said, no, I mean Mbeki. And I went with a pencil, and I changed everywhere that I'd written Mugabe, I put Mbeki, and it fitted like a glove. It was quite a triumph, actually, because I realized it was right.
And the role of the church is
The church, Mugabe's, I think Mugabe, he doesn't go to church, he doesn't attend church, he hasn't done for years and years. Sally converted to Catholicism and used to go, but I think he uses the church, and in particular Father Mukanori, who was the guy that took me to him. Every anniversary of independence, there's Father Mukanori and all his robes, blessing the ceremony and so on. So the church, and not only Father Mukanori, but a number of senior churchmen have enabled Mugabe, definitely. And I think, I do think he's quite religious in a sense, because, his conversation is full of words like sacrifice and suffering. In the interview with me, he used those words quite a lot. I think he sees himself martyred on the cross, I do. And he's very aggrieved, Mugabe, as I say, because he's emotionally so retarded. He doesn't take responsibility for anything. So he's got all these grievances, and he did sacrifice, and he did suffer.
More questions?
Sorry, could you address the issue of sexuality?
Oh, yeah.
Sexuality. Oh, I didn't go there.
You have a huge preoccupation with it. I wonder if it came up at all.
Funny enough, I think one of his preoccupations was being arrested by that guy, that citizen's arrest.
Peter Tatchell.
He was furious about that, but again, mainly because the British allowed it to happen, that nobody came to his rescue. There wasn't a big diplomatic outcry. He was so offended by that. Some people say Mugabe's homosexual. I don't think that's true. I mean, and I explained, some of his body language people attribute to that. I don't think it's the reason. Several people said to me, but I didn't go there because I couldn't stand it. He said that they wondered if he'd been sexually abused in prison. I didn't even go there, of course. Yeah. So I don't know.
Okay, Wilf, and I think there was a lady down here who also wanted to ask a question. Could you wait for the microphone?
My name is Wilf from London. In the event of a Zuma government in South Africa, do you think we could see an end to quiet diplomacy?
I just wanted to know what you thought Mugabe's reaction would be to your book, or whether he would feel betrayed, whether you would feel safe going back to Zimbabwe.
Do you want to take those two?
Okay. I think that Zuma would take a different view. And in fact, when I was sitting there at State House for 3 hours, that's what Chiramba wanted to talk about a lot. I mean, I got such a strong sense in those 3 hours of how cut off all these guys are. They were so keen to talk to me now I'd passed the test, and they wanted to talk to me about the foreign media, and and I said, why don't you let the guys in? We had all this kind of pally conversation. And we talked about the British as well. So, I mean, that's why I know that an approach from the British would actually go down quite well there, but it would have to come from the right level. You mustn't send the local High Commissioner wandering in there. So. But Mugabe doesn't listen to anybody. Zuma may have a different approach, but if Mugabe is still at the helm, I mean, many people speculate, as somebody did there, that the generals are now in charge. I don't actually believe that. I think they joined at the hip. The bloodstained generals and Mugabe are indivisible. But to me, it looks as though Mugabe is still calling all the shots. and he doesn't actually listen. And as I say, he calls him Little Mbeki. You know, when in that hand-holding episode, which got huge play in South Africa, you know, when Mbeki was saying there's no crisis, I mean, absurd stuff. It was Mugabe that was holding the hand. If you have a good look at those clips, it's Mugabe making the running there. It's not Mbeki that's clutching at Mugabe. He just runs rings around the African leaders.
Are you safe going back to Zimbabwe? Would you go back again for another 5-week stint of waiting?
I wouldn't now. I think it's dangerous now, really. I did send copies of the book. I sent 3 copies of the book, as I had said I would, where as soon as I got them, I was given, you know, 10 copies, and I sent 3 to Harare, to Father Makanori, 1 for him, 1 for H.E., and 1 for Chiramba. And I didn't hear anything except Chiramba, who virtually writes the Herald these days, wrote a little comment about this book, Dinner with Mugabe, and mentioned that Heidi Holland seemed to have reduced the president to a Prozac case. And I was so tempted to write a letter saying, if only we'd sent in some Prozac, this wouldn't be going.
I think what's amazing is that when you were there, they were so excited to hear every word you could impart to them. They thought maybe you were an emissary of the West or emissary of the British. And when you're here, everyone in Britain, all the Western diplomats thinks you're the great expert on Mugabe, you know every little word. And your point about, well, maybe there should be a bit more communication between the two sides clearly is right.
Definitely. I think Mugabe, if he were approached, if the British could climb off their high horse, I think you could possibly set something up. I mean, the only model that comes to me is a replay in a way, an all-party conference and a best person government in an interim phase, and then, you know. But I mean, look, it's not for me to work these things out. But I do think more of the same is just not going to go anywhere at all.
More questions? Anyone else want to get something from someone who's actually met Robert Mugabe?
Wilf knows him well.
Gentleman at the back.
I must say I agree with what you've said about Mugabe in the way of his emotional attachment. My name is Alan, I'm Zimbabwean. Yeah, born and raised in Zimbabwe. Just in a hypothetical case, if Mugabe does not get sort of the higher ranking, as we say in Africa, higher ranking officials from Britain to speak to him, do you think he's going to go down fighting till the end? Yes.
Mugabe will stop at nothing. Mugabe doesn't let people matter to him. I think Mugabe is the most dangerous man in the world. He'll stop at nothing. Ian Smith, who I despise, would at least not destroy his own country. Mugabe will... He's so... I asked him, is there a sense in which you're prepared to destroy the welfare of your people in order to make your political points? He said, yes, that's what we're doing. He didn't even argue it. Honestly, Mugabe won't stop until he's stopped. And you won't stop him except, in a way, by embracing him. And I know that's not going to happen in that way. But I do think we need to start a new conversation. And otherwise, the Zimbabweans are going to pay.
Yeah, I think you're right. We can't... I think this is the problem that we're having in the cultures, that we ignore the cultures. I think we've come to a very extreme case like Mugabe, where he's become a leader. We've also realised that. I know, as you grow up, you talked about Mugabe trying to be British. Your aspirations as high as the people that you feel are doing really well. And having grown up as an African, the whites, Zimbabweans, or the British, for that matter, were what you just aspire to be. You'd want to be eating the same food that you'd want to be eating with a knife and fork instead of your hands. And that's what and you've seen a lot of leaders coming up like that, and that's what's happening. We cannot ignore this, and we have to address it. And say, look, these people think differently, and we have to change. I think we really need to change the culture in people, and it's a long process, but that could have been done in the last 30 years if people really did not ignore it like they are now.
Thank you. There's 2 questions here at the front.
Hi, my name is Sabine Gilbert, and I was brought up in Zimbabwe. And I met both Mugabe and Ian Smith. And I can say that I think Ian Smith's very similar in many ways, in that he took absolutely no responsibility. And in fact, in a 2-day interview for the film Rebellion, which I was present at, he never once admitted that he'd made any mistake during that in time. Devastating, because it was devastating to Zimbabwe in many ways. It set the groundwork for what was to come now. and he never once took any responsibility. The question that I want to ask you is, when I was living in Zimbabwe, and did so until 6 years ago, it was very clear to me that the disastrous structural adjustment program that was implemented by the World Bank and the IMF really was what triggered Zimbabwe's economic demise. And I know that Mugabe was really against it, and that it was the Young Turks in the Ministry of Finance that forced him into doing it. And I think he regrets that. And I just wanted to ask you whether you discussed that with him. And I just personally think that the IMF always gets off lightly, and that they're always lingering in the background when something like, a situation like Zimbabwe unfolds. So if you could explain that. And also, just to come back to this gentleman's question, is he asked you whether you had any advice for minority communities in Africa, and whether the whites in South Africa have a role to play. They, not Zuma or Mbeki, what the role of the whites in Zimbabwe, in South Africa is in the coming few years.
Okay, a lot of questions. Do you want to deal with those first?
Well,
and
let
then
me
we'll come over here?
answer that one. Sorry, I think I have maybe a bit of an unconventional view of the role of minority groups in these very fragile democracies, especially when there's a lot of racism that informs a lot of the responses to power. I think we should be as helpful as possible. I don't think we should go head to head. I mean, of course, you have to designate issues, and so there are, the DA, and for example, in South Africa, should be there. But, for example, the electricity crisis in South Africa recently, of course, people are really upset about that, and they immediately think that this is the beginning of the end, and it may well be. But I just think it would be much more constructive if, as a moneyed community with a lot of sins to redress. I mean, one of the reasons that the power goes out in South Africa is because white South Africans failed to train black South Africans to actually do all these skilled jobs, and obviously they're not going to leave whites in the jobs long enough to train the blacks. I mean, it's a sort of built-in catastrophe waiting to happen. So I'm not the best person to ask about how whites should disport themselves. I can only say I think that the MDC made some serious mistakes early on. For example, that disastrous signing of the checks by the white farmers, and the link up with the DA party support, based on white interests in South Africa. And there is huge sensitivity to these things, and of course there's going to be. On Ian Smith, I actually compared Mugabe and Ian Smith. That's how I dealt with Ian Smith in the book. When I went to talk to him, I was astonished at how little self-reflection he had. And I have to say, I think that applies to us I'm a former white Rhodesian and a white South African. I think we have so little self-reflection. And I can see why people like Mbeki just get absolutely furious. He's got a big chip on his shoulder. And going back to the colonial era and the British, as a white parent, for example, I've got two sons. One of them's quite young, or at least he's 25. and he and my challenge with him since he was at school and his last years at school is to try and raise a non-racial, as near as possible, in a very racially charged environment. Now, I've pretty much succeeded, I'd say. But his peers are all feeling very aggrieved now because they are discriminated against, and that's true. So I had to raise him to believe that although he didn't create apartheid, that was me, he benefited from it. But I'm interested why the British people who benefited so much from colonialism, and it's only 50 years ago, it's not an absolute life, it's not really all that long ago, are so quick to say, well, that's all history, let's forget about that. Because in a way, that attitude should come through also among young British people who have no memory of colonialism. And I think that plays very badly with black leaders who themselves have suffered so terribly. I think attitudes are very dismissive, and people forget very quickly about their own history.
There was a question here, just here at the front.
Spur and I work for Amnesty International. One of the questions that I have in my mind a lot is, a lot of what we've talked about tonight are kind of external solutions or externally imposed solutions, sort of diplomacy and what's the role of the West and other leaders. And one of the questions that I have is what's happening in civil society within Zimbabwe. And I understand that people are very scared and that it's a huge risk to challenge the state and that there's enormous repression and that people are hungry, and you can't always organize when you're trying to just go and buy eggs, But one of the things that I do think has been interesting is that there has been this kind of passivity among Zimbabwean people, and I think that is changing with groups like Waza, standing up in communities and towns, kind of resisting, the police and other things. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that. And I don't think the NDC are the right force to organize people in the same way that the ANC did in South Africa, in a community level and at street level, which we saw in the townships in South Africa. And I don't think that's happening in Zim, and I just wondered what your thoughts were.
Shall I answer?
Sure, if you want to take it.
The MDC is what you've got. I think Morgan Tsvangirai has been extraordinarily brave. I remember just in March, just before he got really so badly beaten up, he came and talked to the Foreign Correspondents Association in South Africa, and the Washington Post correspondent was saying, "Why aren't you people out there in the streets?" And the very next day he was there, really pummeled unconscious. So I as to civil society, I think a lot of NGOs have pulled out. I think they're thin on the ground there. I don't actually know chapter and verse about that. That isn't what I studied particularly. But I think a lot of people, like Oxfam Australia are involved there, and a lot of people have left for all kinds of reasons.
I think it's very easy to talk about passive Zimbabweans, but whenever I've been there, even to go out and vote is a hugely brave thing to do when people are watching you so closely that you're being threatened. We know that at least 50 people have been killed since the first round. It's an incredibly tough place to be anything but passive, and Zimbabweans have come out in very large numbers and voted against their president. And
yes, exactly.
That in itself is very tough.
Yes, exactly. Mugabe just changes the rules, and he'll do it this time, I think. I would be most surprised if anything comes out of this runoff. He's been organising also. I think the reason he was so silent in counting those votes was not because they were trying to cook that. It was because he bought some considerable amount of time there. It was like 6 weeks or something. What time he was busy in the rural areas with this new. I don't know if Wilf would agree with that.
Do we have time for a few more questions? There's lots of people who want to ask. Gentleman at the back there, and then another on the left here.
Mark LeBron. A kind of related question. It's really why Mugabe has managed to last so long, and whether it's just because of his control of the state and the military reasons, or whether, just to take some quotes out of context, but it's a feeling I've felt from listening to stuff tonight, that there is this charisma and charm that Mugabe exudes. Zimbabwe lady was saying that he was like a father figure in some respects, and although you said he was the most dangerous man you've met, a lot of what you're talking about his interviews, head dropping and stuff, has it been a factor that you think he's managed to be this charismatic leader and a charmer for 28 years that has, in a sense, kept him where he is, as well as the military clampdown?
Should we take also there's a question, can you raise your hand again? I can't, this person here with the glasses. Yeah.
I think you're describing an element of megalomania, and I'm thinking he's in the same bracket as Hitler, Idi Amin, Pol Pot, all of whom were overthrown by force of arms by their neighbours, if you categorise the Russians as being the neighbours of the Germans. Given, for example, what's happened in the Congo, which ultimately collapsed into a failed state, and I think there's something like 6 or 7 national armies involved there in the moment, if, as you described, he will stop at nothing, he will hold on till the bitter, bitter end, is the inevitability here that it will be force of arms will overthrow in the end from neighbouring states?
Do you want to take those two? The big questions.
What was the first?
The first one was, is it charisma or is it military power that holds him in office?
Well, let me just take that first. Mugabe came to politics reluctantly. He he wanted to be a school teacher, and he was kind of picked out by ZANU-PF because he was so eloquent. He speaks very eloquently. He was much better educated than most of the nationalists at the time. He had a salary. He had a job in Ghana. You know, he stuck out. He was really very unusual. And ZANU-PF, which is a vile organization, had a real image problem. And so they lured Mugabe. If he'd been a headmaster, I think he would have been great. I mean, actually, his legacy of education in Africa is a lasting one. As you know, you can't take that away from him. He can't also ride on it for any longer. And in fact, the education system is busy collapsing. But he educated people to an extraordinary level in Zimbabwe. He also had very creative policies. Like when he came in, don't forget the war had ravaged schools in the rural areas. He had all sorts of creative schemes in the Commonwealth. For example, he appealed to Commonwealth teachers who had different school holidays to come and give their services and teach in the rural areas. He took the senior students out of schools and enticed them into the rural areas. You know, he was extraordinary in his early years, especially as a teacher. Mbeki, for example, is an economist. So Mbeki's economic policies are okay, but in South Africa we've absolutely squandered 15 years in terms of education. It's shocking, really. We've thrown money at it, but there's no political will to kind of deal with it. So the problem with Mugabe, there'll be a dozen people in this room whose emotional makeup is just like Mugabe's. But they don't have armies and brutalized police forces to act out their rage. You know, he himself is not that unusual a person. And the problem is he's got all this power, and he uses it, and he doesn't let people matter. I think that's why he's unusual. I don't think he's a charmer, really.
There was a question here at the front. Oh, sorry. No, sorry. Is the only way to get Mugabe out of office through the barrel of a gun?
Gee, I don't know. Well, I don't through the neighbours. Well, you know, as you know, the SADC has a provision that in the event of a military coup, that neighbouring countries can take military issue. I don't see that happening in terms of South Africa, although there are people who advocate that. I think that's a bit out of my scope. I'd just be guessing, you know, I don't know.
Fair enough. Okay, final question here at the front. Sorry, making you walk all the way. If you can say who you are as well.
My name is Bernard Mavunga. I grew up in Zimbabwe and spent most of my childhood there. Actually speaking, Angela Gwawaza and myself, we were one of the first black kids at Highlands Junior School, which was a government school in a very sort of affluent area. And growing up in Zimbabwe had a lot of, it was easy to go to the first all-white school, but it also had its problems. And in a way, I can sort of identify with Mugabe's anger at, you know, things that have happened at a later stage. You know, whether it's he feels slightly betrayed. But my question is, when you met Mugabe, did you feel like there's other forces at play, or was it just sort of a man consumed, I mean, with all the power sort of sitting in one room that, because my worry is that, you know, there's been debate that there is, the generals have taken over in Zimbabwe at the moment, and, you know, we're not really sure where the country will go. I mean, is Mugabe going? Does that mean this is the end of the madness that's happening in Zimbabwe at the moment?
Thank you.
I don't think Mugabe's going anywhere. I think he's going to win on his own terms, and his wife pretty much said that the other day. I wouldn't rule out that, as I say, if he were approached in a respectful way, which, you know, is almost impossible now given all the rhetoric that flies around all the time. I think it's a pity that Gordon Brown didn't keep his gunpowder dry after Tony Blair left, but anyway, that's water under the bridge. I wouldn't be that surprised. I don't know if anybody agrees with me. Wilf is my reference point. If Mugabe wouldn't, once he's proved that he's been re-elected, if he wouldn't negotiate some sort of power sharing thing. I wouldn't never use unity government, you know, this is much too cozy a term with the MDC, but the model I would use is best person government, because this is something Mugabe knows. This is something that he brought in, and those were his glory days actually, when he worked with Sobes and he was magnanimous and he pulled the whites with him, you know, and I'm sure he would like to be like that, you know, again. So I definitely think if anybody can get some sort of initiative to Mugabe that offers him a different way of going about things, I really think it should be done, even if it doesn't succeed, because the whole thing is so sterile now, you know, in terms of any, as I say, the fact that everybody asks me questions, you know, who am I? And yet there's nobody else to ask. It speaks volumes for a need for different conversation in Zimbabwe, I think.
Well, thanks, Heidi. I think we all want to show our appreciation for your great talking.
Thank you.